Samuel Hart had always known that life in the dry lands of the Southwest would never be easy, but he had never imagined how lonely and demanding it could become. He was a simple man with simple dreams. All he wanted was a small ranch where he could raise a few cattle, live peacefully, and enjoy the quiet of open land. The sky was wide, the earth was rough, and the wind moved across the plains like a whisper that carried stories from mountains far away. But even in this quiet landscape, every day required effort, patience, and hope. Samuel had inherited nothing from his parents except a few tools, a tired old horse, and a belief that hard work would lead to a better life. With the little savings he had, he bought a small piece of land on the edge of a remote settlement. It wasn't good land, not the kind rich farmers wanted. The soil was thin, the grass was short, and water was almost impossible to find. But it was all Samuel could afford, and he accepted it with gratitude. He believed he could make something out of it if he put his heart into the work. During his first year on the ranch, Samuel spent his days repairing fences, clearing stones, and building a small wooden home with his own hands. It leaned slightly to one side, but it kept the wind out and gave him a place to rest. He planted a garden behind the house and dug shallow trenches to direct rainwater whenever the sky offered a blessing. The land answered slowly, giving him a few vegetables and helping his cattle survive, though they remained thin and uncertain. Then the long drought began. At first, Samuel didn't worry. Dry spells came and went, and he knew the land often tested those who lived on it. But weeks passed with no rain, then months. The earth cracked like old pottery, and the air grew so dry that even the morning breeze felt warm. Dust rose with every step Samuel took. The little pond near his home, which had once been a home for tiny frogs, shrank until it was nothing but a shallow, muddy patch. His cattle wandered restlessly, their tongues dry, their ribs becoming visible. Each morning, Samuel would walk the land with a heavy heart, checking the animals, touching their sides, and whispering calming words, as if his voice could change the sky. The drought didn't just affect Samuel. The nearby settlement struggled too. Wells ran low, gardens failed, and talk around town became tense. People worried about the future, about their families, about the land they depended on. Many started blaming things they didn't understand. Some blamed travelers. Some blamed the changes in nature. And some blamed the Apache groups who lived in distant hills. Samuel didn't know what to believe, so he kept quiet. He didn't want to judge anyone he had never met. He simply wished for rain. One morning, after a particularly hot night, Samuel woke to find one of his young calves lying on the ground, too weak to stand. He knelt beside it, brushing away flies with his hat. The calf looked up at him with tired eyes, and Samuel felt a sharp ache in his chest. He needed water. Not just for himself, but for every creature depending on him. So he decided to explore the far edges of his land, hoping to find something that he had missed before. He packed a small bag with bread, a tin cup, and a rope, then saddled his old horse, Rusty. Rusty was slow, but faithful, and seemed to understand every worry Samuel carried. Together, they traveled across the dry fields, past old oak trees that had lost their green leaves, and toward a rocky area Samuel rarely visited. The deeper he went, the more silent the land became. Even birds seemed afraid to waste their energy in the heat. Hours passed, and Samuel began to doubt himself. Maybe there really was nothing here. Maybe he was only tiring his horse for no good reason. But just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye. A faint glimmer, almost too small to notice. He stopped Rusty and stepped down. The ground near a large rock looked slightly darker than the rest. He knelt, touched the soil, and felt a surprise run through his fingertips. It was damp. His heart beat faster as he cleared some dirt with his hands. Slowly, carefully, a small trickle of water appeared, dark and thin, but undeniably real. Samuel let out a long breath that almost felt like a laugh. He dug some more, widening the space around the wet patch. The trickle grew stronger, turning into a tiny stream that filled a shallow hollow in the soil. It was a spring, a weak, hidden spring, but enough to bring life back to his land. With shaking hands, he brought Rusty closer so the horse could drink. The animal lowered its head eagerly, taking slow, grateful sips. Samuel filled his tin cup and tasted the water. It was cool, fresh, and cleaner than anything he had drunk in weeks. He closed his eyes, letting relief wash over him. In that moment, Samuel felt hope return. He could save his cattle. He could survive this drought. This small discovery, almost invisible to anyone else, meant everything to him. He spent the rest of the afternoon widening the spring, placing stones around it to protect the edges. He built a low fence to guide his animals safely toward it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, he felt the confidence that life would continue. As the sun set behind the hills, Samuel stood on the dusty path and looked across his land. The sky turned golden, then orange, then deep red. The silence of evening wrapped around him. Normally, this quiet made him feel lonely, but today he felt something warmer: peace. He knew that the land had not abandoned him. It had given him a gift at the moment he needed it the most. But even as Samuel enjoyed this rare moment of calm, he sensed something else in the air, something subtle but present. Maybe it was the way the wind changed direction, or the way Rusty kept lifting his head as if listening to distant footsteps. Samuel tried to ignore the feeling, telling himself it was only his tired mind playing tricks on him. He didn't yet know that someone had been watching him from the hills above. He didn't yet know that others were struggling through the same drought, searching for water just like he was. And he had no idea that the small spring he had found, his one fragile lifeline, would soon bring unexpected visitors to his land. Visitors he had been taught to fear. Visitors who would change the course of his life in a way he could never have imagined. For now, though, Samuel simply walked back home, guiding Rusty with gentle hands. The stars appeared one by one, shining brighter than usual against the dark sky. Samuel felt tired but hopeful, unaware that the quiet world around him was slowly shifting. The spring had saved him, and in the days ahead, it would become the center of a story that reached far beyond his small ranch. It was the beginning of something he could not yet understand, something that would test his courage, shape his heart, and forever change the way he looked at the people who shared these dry, beautiful lands. Samuel woke early the next morning, just as the first soft light touched the horizon. He stepped outside with a cup of warm coffee in his hands and breathed in the cool air. Even though the drought still covered the land like a heavy blanket, the small spring he had found gave him a new sense of strength. His cattle seemed calmer, moving slowly toward the rising sun. Rusty, his horse, stood near the fence, flicking his tail as if saying good morning. Everything felt a little brighter. After drinking his coffee, Samuel walked to the spring to check if the water was still flowing. He had been worried through the night, afraid the water might have dried again, but when he reached the spot, he found the small stream still trickling gently into the shallow hollow he had shaped. He knelt down and touched the cool surface. It was still there, steady and promising. He spent the next few hours guiding stones around the edges, trying to keep the water clean. He didn't have much skill in building, but he worked with patience and care. When he was finished, he sat on a flat rock and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Even though it was still morning, the sun had already warmed the air. Samuel lifted his face to the sky and hoped for clouds, but the sky remained clear and wide, without a single sign of rain. While resting, he suddenly felt something, a quiet stillness different from the usual silence of the plains. It was almost like the land was holding its breath, Rusty, who had been grazing nearby, lifted his head sharply and looked toward the distant hills. His ears twitched. Samuel frowned, shading his eyes with his hand as he followed Rusty's gaze. At first he saw nothing but heat waves rising from the ground, but slowly, shapes began to appear on the horizon. They were small at first, dark against the bright light. Samuel squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing. As the shapes came closer, he realized they were riders, several of them, moving in a slow, tired line. His heartbeat quickened. He stood up, brushing the dust from his clothes. Riders usually meant travelers or neighbors, but something about their movements felt different. They were not moving confidently or quickly. Their horses walked with heads low, as if exhausted, and the riders sat in a way that suggested they had been traveling for a long time. Samuel felt a mix of curiosity and concern. Visitors were rare in this remote area. He stepped back toward the fence, not out of fear, but out of caution. He had learned to respect the land and everyone who lived on it, even if he didn't know them. As the riders came closer, he began to see their clothing more clearly. Simple, traditional garments, worn from sun and travel. That's when he realized who they were: Apache riders. He had heard stories about them since he first moved to the settlement, stories filled with warnings, worries, and misunderstandings. Some settlers spoke as if the Apache were always ready to cause trouble, but Samuel never agreed completely. He had never met an Apache person before, so he didn't know what was true and what was just fear. But he knew one thing for certain. The riders he was looking at now did not seem threatening. They looked tired, very tired. As they approached the boundary of his land, Samuel noticed more details. Their faces were worn from heat. Their horses looked almost as thirsty as his cattle had been. One of the riders, an older man with thoughtful eyes and long dark hair, lifted his hand. A calm gesture, not demanding, not threatening, just acknowledging Samuel's presence. Samuel hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He thought about the spring behind him. It wasn't much water, but it was precious, and he had worked so hard to keep his cattle alive. But then he looked at the riders again, at their slow breathing, their dry lips, their weary expressions. They weren't here to cause him trouble. They were simply in need of something every human being needed: water. The older rider stepped forward slowly, his movements gentle. He didn't rush. He didn't try to come too close. He simply pointed to the empty gourd hanging from his side. Then he touched his chest, then gestured toward the spring. Samuel felt something shift inside him. All at once, the choice became clear. He remembered how he had felt when he first found the water, tired, desperate, and full of hope. He remembered kneeling beside the spring, tasting fresh water, feeling life return to his body. If water had saved him, why should he deny it to others? He nodded slowly. The older rider gave a soft, grateful expression, one that needed no words. Samuel stepped aside from the fence and motioned with his hand, inviting them toward the spring. The riders approached with quiet respect, guiding their horses gently. They didn't rush to the water. Instead, they let their animals drink first, watching them with care. Samuel stood nearby, observing. The older rider knelt at the spring, scooping water with both hands and drinking slowly, as if each sip was a gift. The younger riders followed, filling their gourds, washing their faces, refreshing themselves in silence. There was no loud talking, no impatience, only gratitude and relief. Samuel felt his heart soften. These people were not what the stories had described. They weren't frightening and they weren't careless. They were simply travelers caught in the same drought he was struggling through. They respected his land, his spring, and his presence. They treated everything with gentle hands. After a few minutes, the older rider walked toward Samuel. He placed his hand on his chest again and nodded, clearly offering thanks. Samuel nodded back, unsure of how to respond with words, but hoping his quiet smile was enough. He wanted to say something, maybe introduce himself, but he didn't know whether they spoke English or whether his words would be understood. So he relied on simple gestures, open hands, a calm expression, and a respectful nod. Sometimes, he thought, kindness didn't need a long speech. It only needed sincerity. The older rider looked around, studying the land for a moment, as if noticing the effort Samuel had put into protecting the spring. He pointed to the stones Samuel had placed, then gave another approving nod. Samuel felt a small sense of pride. Even strangers could see he had worked hard. As the riders prepared to leave, one of the younger men handed Samuel a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Samuel hesitated, but the rider insisted gently. Inside the cloth was a handful of dried herbs and a small piece of carved wood with a simple design. It was a gift, a small gesture of appreciation. Samuel accepted it with gratitude, touched by their thoughtfulness. The riders mounted their horses once more. Before turning away, the older rider looked back at Samuel, and for a moment their eyes met. It was a quiet exchange, respect for respect, kindness for kindness, humanity for humanity. Then the group rode off toward the distant hills, their figures slowly fading into the golden afternoon light. Samuel stood there long after they had disappeared. He looked at the spring, then at the bundle in his hands. His heart felt fuller than it had in months. He realized something important. Fear had kept many people apart, but trust, even a small amount, had the power to bring them closer. He didn't know what this moment would lead to. He didn't know that these same riders would one day return in a way he never expected. All he knew was that he had made the right choice today. And in the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he felt the land breathe again. Not in fear, but in peace. For several days after the Apache riders left his land, Samuel could not stop thinking about the quiet moment they had shared. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, the tired horses, the gentle gestures, the look of gratitude in the older rider's eyes. It felt like a memory carved into his heart, something that would stay with him for a long time. He had not spoken a single word to them, yet he felt as if they had shared a meaningful conversation without needing language. Life on the ranch continued as usual, but something inside Samuel had changed. He felt less alone. The land felt more alive. Whenever he walked to the spring, he looked at the smooth stones he had placed around it and remembered the respectful way the riders had knelt to drink. He began to understand that kindness, even a small amount, could build silent bridges between people. One quiet morning, Samuel was repairing a fence post when he heard a soft rustling from behind a mesquite bush. Rusty, his loyal horse, lifted his head and gave a gentle snort, but did not seem worried. Samuel set down his hammer and slowly walked closer. To his surprise, he found a small woven basket placed neatly at the base of the bush. Inside the basket were fresh berries, dried fruit, and a simple necklace made of tiny carved beads. Samuel stood still for a moment, unsure what to think. There was no note, no sign of who left it, but he knew immediately where it had come from. He felt a warm smile curl on his lips. The Apache riders had returned, but not openly. They had left a quiet sign of gratitude. This gesture filled him with happiness, not because of the basket itself, though it was useful, but because it meant they trusted him enough to return. It meant they understood he would welcome their kindness just as he had welcomed them to his spring. It also meant they cared, in their quiet, respectful way, to show appreciation. Days passed, and life settled into a gentle rhythm. Samuel spent mornings tending to his cattle, afternoons repairing broken tools or riding Rusty across the land, and evenings sitting outside his small home, watching the colors change across the sky. Even though the drought still covered the region, he felt calm knowing he had water, hope, and a newfound connection he had never expected. One afternoon, as the sun hung overhead like a bright silver coin, Samuel noticed something unusual in the air. The wind carried a faint rumble, not thunder, not hooves, but something different. He paused, listening carefully. Rusty pricked his ears. The cattle stopped grazing and turned their heads toward the sound. Samuel felt a small knot of worry tighten in his stomach. Moments later, he saw movement along the distant path, dust rising behind a group of horses and men. Their clothing was different from the Apache riders. Their posture was different too, alert, formal, hurried. Samuel recognized them immediately. They were soldiers from the settlement. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked slowly toward the fence, unsure why they were coming. Soldiers rarely traveled this far unless something important had happened. As they came closer, he saw that the leader, a young officer with a stiff posture, was scanning the land with sharp eyes. "Afternoon," Samuel greeted politely when they reached him. The officer nodded but did not smile. His gaze drifted past Samuel, looking at the land as if searching for something hidden. "We're on patrol," he said. "Have you seen anything unusual in the past few days?" Samuel felt his heartbeat quicken. Memories of the Apache riders flashed through his mind, their tired faces, their quiet gratitude, the peaceful moment by the spring. He realized instantly that the soldiers were not here for a friendly visit. They were looking for someone. He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Nothing troubling," he said honestly. "Just trying to keep my cattle alive, same as everyone else." The officer looked unconvinced. He motioned for one of the soldiers to ride further ahead and check the area. Samuel felt uncomfortable but kept his expression calm. He knew it was not wise to reveal anything that might create misunderstandings or fuel fear. He knew the riders who had visited him were peaceful. They were not a threat. They had shown only respect. The soldiers continued searching for a few minutes, riding near the spring and examining the ground. Samuel tried to stay relaxed, though every moment felt longer than the last. When the soldier returned and shook his head, the officer finally turned back to Samuel. "Well," the officer said, "if you see any unfamiliar riders, report it to the settlement. There have been rumors of movement in the area." Samuel nodded quietly. The officer tipped his hat and gave the signal for the patrol to move on. Dust rose behind them as they rode away, leaving the ranch in silence again. But Samuel did not feel alone. He knew someone else had been watching the soldiers too. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Samuel went to the spring to check the water. To his surprise, he found footprints, light, soft, careful footprints, around the edges. They were fresh. His heart lifted. He looked around calmly, as if admiring the view, and soon saw a familiar figure step out from behind a tall juniper tree. It was the older Apache rider, Nantan. He approached slowly, respectfully. Samuel felt no fear, only relief. Nantan stopped a few steps away, placing his hand on his chest in greeting. Samuel did the same, offering a warm nod. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding. Samuel could see wisdom in the older man's gentle eyes. He could also see awareness. Nantan had clearly watched the soldiers from a distance. He knew they had been searching. Nantan pointed toward the path the soldiers had taken, then shook his head softly as if saying he meant no trouble. Samuel understood completely. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, trying to communicate the truth. "You're safe here." Nantan seemed to understand. A calm expression relaxed his face. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger riders, someone Samuel recognized from their first visit, appeared carrying a bundle wrapped in animal hide. He handed it to Nantan, who then carefully placed it at Samuel's feet. Samuel knelt and unwrapped it. Inside, he found something that made his throat tighten with emotion. a small collection of items the Apache people considered useful or meaningful. Dried food, herbs, a few smooth stones that looked like they were chosen with care, and a finely polished wooden piece with a subtle design. It was not a payment. It was a sign of trust, a sign of friendship. Samuel touched the items gently. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure if they understood the words but hoping they felt the meaning. Nantan nodded and smiled, a peaceful, genuine smile that felt rare in these difficult times. Before leaving, the older rider placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder, a simple gesture but filled with sincerity. Then the riders quietly slipped back into the hills, moving like part of the landscape itself. As night fell, Samuel sat by the spring, thinking about what had just happened. He felt honored, he felt grateful, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time: connection. He realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into a bond of understanding. A bond strong enough that the Apache riders now saw him as someone who respected them, someone who saw them as people, not rumors, someone worth protecting. Little did Samuel know that this small bond, formed beside a humble stream of water, would soon create a ripple across the region, changing not just his life, but the way two very different communities viewed one another. The days that followed felt different for Samuel, as if a quiet thread now connected him to something larger than his small ranch. Every sunrise seemed softer, every breeze carried a gentler sound, and even the animals on his land behaved with a calmer spirit. He still worked long hours, repairing fences, tending to his cattle and caring for the spring, but he no longer felt like he was struggling alone. There was a new sense of purpose in everything he did. One morning, Samuel walked to the spring and noticed something surprising. Small stones had been arranged neatly along the edge in a careful pattern, smooth, flat stones placed in a curved line, almost like a simple decoration or a mark of respect. Samuel hadn't done it. He looked around, scanning the hills, and smiled quietly to himself. The Apache riders had visited again, silently, just to honor the place that gave them water. He touched one of the stones gently. It felt warm from the sun, but carried a sense of meaning, as if someone had placed it with thought and gratitude. Samuel appreciated their quiet way of communicating. They didn't need words. Their actions spoke clearly. As the days passed, the drought continued, but Samuel noticed that the evenings were becoming cooler. Clouds sometimes drifted across the sky, thin and pale, like early signs of hope. He didn't say it out loud, but deep inside, he felt that change was coming. The land had endured the dryness for so long that even the faintest sign of moisture felt like a promise. One afternoon, while Samuel was checking the wooden posts near his cattle pen, he heard Rusty give a soft nicker. The horse was standing near the spring, his ears pointed forward. Samuel walked over, wiping dust from his hands, and soon saw a familiar figure waiting patiently under the shade of a tall mesquite tree. It was Nantan, the older Apache rider. Samuel felt a warm wave of relief and welcome. He walked toward him with calm steps. Nantan nodded with his usual graceful kindness. Even without speaking, he carried a peaceful strength that made Samuel feel safe and understood. A moment later, two younger riders stepped forward. They carried something between them, a folded blanket wrapped tightly around a large object. They set it down near Samuel, then stepped back respectfully. Samuel knelt to unwrap it. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden vessel, smooth, carved with patterns of flowing lines and gentle curves. It was wide and sturdy, designed to hold water. Samuel had never seen craftsmanship like this up close. Every line told a story. Every curve felt intentional. It was a gift of great effort and meaning. Samuel looked up at Nantan, unsure how to express the gratitude he felt. He placed his hand over his heart, and bowed his head slightly. It was the simplest gesture he could think of, but it came from the deepest part of him. Nantan's eyes softened. He touched his own chest lightly and then pointed at the spring. Samuel understood. The vessel was meant to help him care for the water, a gift of friendship, trust, and shared respect for the land. For a few quiet minutes, they stood together near the spring. The sound of trickling water filled the silence, and the warm breeze carried the scent of dry grass and distant sage. It felt peaceful. It felt meaningful. It felt like two different worlds standing side by side without fear. Eventually, Nantan raised his hand in farewell. The younger riders did the same. They mounted their horses and rode toward the hills, moving with easy grace. Samuel watched them go, feeling a sense of calm pride. He knew they would return someday, maybe not soon, but someday, because the bond between them had become stronger than the drought. Near sunset that same day, something unusual happened. Clouds gathered thick and low in the sky. The wind shifted, bringing a coolness that had been missing for months. Samuel stepped outside and looked up, hardly believing his eyes. Rusty lifted his head. The cattle gathered, sensing change in the air. Then, with a soft whisper like a secret being shared, the first raindrop fell. It landed on Samuel's hand, cool, clean, full of promise. Another drop followed, then another, until the sky opened gently, releasing a soothing rain. It wasn't heavy or harsh. It fell in a patient rhythm, soaking into the thirsty ground. Samuel closed his eyes and let the cool drops run down his face. His heart felt full, almost too full. He whispered a quiet thank you, perhaps to the sky, perhaps to the land, perhaps to everything that had brought him to this moment. The rain continued into the night, soft and steady. When Samuel checked the spring the next morning, he found it clearer and stronger than ever. The land, though still dry in many places, began to show small signs of new life. Grass pushed tiny green blades through the earth. The air smelled fresher. Birds returned to the area, their songs lifting the silence that had hung over the plains. As Samuel walked across his land, he thought about everything that had happened these past months. The drought, the fear, the unexpected meeting, the gentle friendship that had grown one simple gesture at a time. He understood something deeper now, something he had learned not through books or stories, but through experience. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could change the direction of life. Sometimes, offering something as simple as water could build trust where none existed. Sometimes, seeing another human being not as a stranger but as a person made all the difference. He knew the moment at the spring, the moment he shared water with the riders, had changed more than just a single day. It had created a new connection that stretched across differences and misunderstandings. It had shown him that kindness could travel farther than fear. Later that week, Samuel rode Rusty toward the ridge, where he had first seen the riders months ago. He sat for a while, watching the endless land spread out before him. The hills looked softer after the rain. The sky seemed wider, clearer. Somewhere in the distance, he imagined the Apache riders watching the changing weather, feeling the same hope that warmed his own chest. He didn't expect anything in return for what he had done. He didn't need recognition. The friendship itself was enough. The peace it brought was enough. Years later, people in the settlement would speak quietly about the time the drought ended, the time the Apache riders became calmer in the nearby region, the time misunderstandings softened on both sides. Some said it started with a simple act. Some said it started with a quiet man who offered water to those who needed it most. Samuel never claimed credit. He always smiled gently and said the land itself deserved the praise. He would say that kindness was like water. It flowed naturally when not blocked by fear. He would say that respect could create a bridge stronger than any wall. But deep inside, he knew the truth. It all began with a moment beside a spring, a moment where compassion was stronger than suspicion, a moment where two different worlds met in peace. And that simple moment, in a quiet corner of dry land, changed more than one man's life. It changed the way hearts understood each other. It changed the way the land felt under the sun. It changed the way the future opened itself, slowly, gently, hopefully. Samuel lived the rest of his life with gratitude for that day, knowing that the memory would stay with him forever, like a calm stream running through the center of his heart. A poor rancher had given water to those who needed it. And that simple act changed everything.